In 1987, I was sitting in the office of Dave DeBusschere. This was no ordinary day on the job. DeBusschere was one of my favorite players on my favorite team, the Knicks of the late 60s and the early 70s. At that point, he was working in the corporate world. DeBusschere had been an incredibly influential player on the teams that won championships in 1970 and 1973. In fact, he was the final cog in a beautiful puzzle coming over in a trade with Detroit in late 1968. He'll always be beloved here for his influential role in the two Knicks championship teams. He died far too soon in 2003. But on that day in 1987, as I was interviewing him for a radio special, on the beautiful Knicks, the championship Knicks, for WNBC radio, I remember him getting a certain look on his face and him saying, football's not New York's game, baseball's not New York's game, but basketball is New York's game. The game grew up here. The terminology for the game was created here. And I'll never forget the look on his face and that kind of wistful tone he took when talking about basketball. I'm Bud Mishkin. This is Bud Mishkin Remembers. Thank you for watching. This episode, the City Game. I love hockey. I really love hockey. And there is nothing greater. It's right up there, hockey and basketball, 1 and 1A. There is nothing greater than Stanley Cup playoff hockey. More passionate, more intense. But in New York, there is nothing greater than a Knicks playoff run. I was incredibly fortunate in the 1990s. The Knicks were really good in the playoffs every year. And I was covering sports in New York for New York One. So from 1993 to 2001, I pretty much covered every Knicks playoff game. And trust me, I knew at the time how fortunate I was, both the home games and on the road. And so I got to know Chicago. I got to know Miami. And I certainly got to know Indianapolis. Covering the Riley, Ewing, Mason, Oak, Van Gundy, Starks, Houston, Sprewell Knicks of the 90s went far beyond covering the games and the practices, which went on for ages. It was kind of all around you. I was living in the city at that time, and you could hear it on the subway when you'd hear fans talking after a game or the next day after a game, talking about Patrick and Mace and John and Oak, all on a first name basis because it felt like a family thing. And it was. It was very personal. Pat Riley asked Knicks fans to buy in when he came to coach in 1991, and they bought in, all the way in a personal, passionate way. That's what made Riley's exit in 1995 so painful and personal. Knicks fans thought, wait, you asked us to buy in, we bought in, now you're leaving us? By fax? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Arguably, the best Knicks team of that era was the 92-93 team that went to the conference finals against Chicago. That was Patrick and Oak, Doc Rivers, Xavier McDaniels, along with Starks and Mason. Game 5 at the Garden is certainly remembered in 1993 by Knicks fans as the Bulls beat the Knicks with, if you're a Chicago fan, a great last-second defensive stand. What doesn't get remembered from that game that much is that much of the talk immediately after the game and in the papers the next day was that Charles Smith got fouled in those last few seconds as the Bulls denied him a basket, and it wasn't called. Now, Charles Smith would bear the brunt of that loss unfairly, I thought, and he was one of my favorite players to cover. He's a very thoughtful guy. But the take after the game, and people don't quite remember this, was that where was the foul call? After the Bulls won that series in Game 6 back in Chicago, Pat Riley sat at the press conference table in the old Chicago stadium, and near the end of his comments, he said, "We will always be coming back." For some reason, amidst 1,000 post-game comments, I never forgot that one, kind of the look on his face and the way he put it. We will always be coming back. What I remember most from that series is personal. It was my first NBA playoffs covering. A year before, I'd been covering high school basketball in upstate New York. A year later, I was sitting in the great old Chicago stadium, 2 rows behind Pat Riley, because the NBA hadn't quite figured out yet you can sell all those seats for thousands of dollars and put the media way up top. No, I was still at that point sitting 2 rows behind Pat Riley, and no disrespect to covering high school basketball, but at that moment, I felt pretty good about the job change I had made a year earlier. The atmosphere in the old Chicago Stadium during the Jordan Bulls of the 90s was just remarkable. The Bulls were, if not the first, at the beginning of the big, garish starting lineup presentation that has become a cliche, and now that whole routine. Early on, and in Chicago, it was exciting. And when they announced number 23 from North Carolina, you really couldn't hear yourself think it was so loud. And you'd have to have a heart of stone, regardless of who you were rooting for or not rooting at all, to not have some goosebumps in those moments. 1994 was different for a big reason and an obvious reason. No Jordan. He'd gone off to play baseball. That series is remembered for the Pippen game, Game 3 in Chicago, when Scottie Pippen, during a timeout, refused to go back into the game with 1.8 seconds left in the fourth quarter because the play was not called for him. Pippen sat. Tony Kukoc hit the game-winning shot. But the talk after the game, the post-game, was Pippen, especially in the Bulls locker room, and a sense that Pippen had let his teammates down. The Knicks got a fortunate foul call near the end of Game 5 at the Garden, giving Hubert Davis 3 foul shots, and they eventually won that game and eventually took the series in 7. Those were close series, 93 and 94, between the Knicks and Bulls. The series in 1996 was not. That was the year the Bulls won 72 games and were clearly the better team. But as the rivalry with the Bulls was coming to an end, forgot to mention the fight in 94 between Derek Harper and JoJo English and everybody on the floor, and happening right in front of the commissioner at the Chicago Stadium. That was pretty memorable too. But the rivalry with the Bulls, as it was cooling, the new one was starting with the Miami Heat. The rivalry with the Heat really began when Pat Riley left the Knicks during the summer of 1995 and eventually signed on with the Heat. December 19th, 1995 was one of my favorite nights ever at the Garden, Riley's return, albeit with an injury-depleted roster with the Miami Heat. I think Alonzo was out that game, and the Knicks handled the Heat pretty well that night. But it was incredibly dramatic, incredibly theatrical when when Riley walked out. The boos, incredibly loud, the Knicks fans acting like spurned lovers, which they were, reacting in a passionately negative way, and Riley taking to it, saying, come on, which was just great. The game, again, not much because the Heat had a bunch of players who were hurt. The post-game was craziness. How someone didn't get hurt was a minor miracle. Everybody crowded into the small room around Riley, like 100 people, and asking questions and so on and so forth. But that was a regular season game. The rivalry really took root in the spring of 1997 when the Knicks played the Heat in the second round of the playoffs. And at the end of Game 5 in Miami, P.J. Brown of the Heat, Charlie Ward of the Knicks get into a fight, and a bunch of Knicks come off the bench. You're not allowed to do that. And there were suspensions. Now, if they suspended all the players for one game, the Knicks wouldn't have enough players to play the game. So they spread it out. Patrick Ewing, Charlie Ward, and Allen Houston were suspended for Game 6 at the Garden on a Friday night. And John Starks and Larry Johnson were suspended for Game 7 in Miami. And though the Knicks played valiantly in both games, the Knicks lost. The Heat came all the way back from a 3-1 deficit in games and won that series in 7. But the Knicks would go on to win against the Heat in 98, 99, and 2000. In 98, the great image is of another fight with Alonzo Mourning and Jeff Van Gundy holding on to Alonzo Mourning's leg for some reason, an image that even Jeff laughed at subsequently. 1999, the lockout year, Allen Houston's last-second shot in Game 5, which was the final game, was an opening round series. His shot goes in at Miami, propelling the Knicks eventually to the finals and a loss against the San Antonio Spurs. So Knicks Bulls was great. Knicks Heat was like a family thing. As long as Pat Riley was around, it was going to be intense and it was going to be personal. But for me, there was nothing like Knicks Pacers. 6 series in all. The Knicks won 3, the Pacers won 3. The Knicks won 2 of the 3 in the early and mid 90s, and then later on, the Pacers won 2 of 3. It was pitched as Knicks versus the Hicks, which was a catchy phrase, but that was ridiculous. Come on. The Pacers had plenty of players who were very media savvy and who were actually more New York than some of the Knicks were. Chris Mullin, Mark Jackson, and of course, Reggie, who was smart, had a sharp sense of humor, clearly with an appetite for the bright lights, both in terms of dealing with the media and also in terms of the games, especially at the Garden. And the matchups on the court were great. The Knicks had Oak and Mace. The Pacers had Dale Davis, Antonio Davis, Patrick Ewing, Rick Smits, the Knick guards, Doc Rivers, Derek Harper, John Starks, and of course, Reggie. 25 points in the fourth quarter of Game 5 to kind of establish his legend in New York in 1994 to go along with the choke artist sign to Spike Lee, and that gets started. Then the next year, the Knicks won that series, a great series in 94. And then the next year, in the first game, he hits 8 points in 9 seconds at the end of regulation, including 2 3-pointers. And the Pacers go on to win Game 1 at the Garden. And then at the end of that series, when the Pacers finally broke through and beat the Knicks because they had lost in 93 and 94, Reggie ran to center court and kissed the Knicks logo, kissed center court. The 3 series at the end of the 90s were still compelling. 2 won by the Pacers, 1 by the Knicks in 1999 with the Larry Johnson 4-point shot. Many of the characters had changed, but Reggie was still there and still tormenting the Knicks. 34 points in Game 6, the 6th and deciding game at the Garden in the year 2000, sending the Pacers to the NBA Finals. The Knicks had gone to the NBA Finals over the Pacers the year before. So the Garden loved to hate Reggie, and there were all sorts of chants, profane and otherwise, and boos and so on. But there was always a begrudging respect. You knew it. And so when Reggie played his final game at the Garden in 2005, there was a standing ovation at the beginning of the game and a standing ovation at the end of the game. Game knows game. My favorite moments from those years were still the personal ones, the small moments away from the camera's eye. I was so nervous before many of those games, especially the Knick Pacer games, that in Indiana, in the old Market Square Arena, you could go on the court before the game, not during the game. You could go on the court and then walk to the very top of Market Square Arena. You didn't have to leave the arena. You could just see the court the whole time and just walk up steps that started at the court and went to the very top. And it was a big arena. You didn't have to go outside into the corridors. So I'd go all the way up top and then come all the way back down every game at Market Square. There was Coach Larry Brown in 1994, again, a series that was nip and tuck the whole way, especially Game 7, 2 points, 4 points, either way. And the Knicks finally prevail. And Larry Brown approaches the press conference table at the Garden, and his shirt is out, his tie is askew. He looks exhausted. He looks like he didn't coach the game. He looked like he played the game. And of course, Reggie. After Game 2 in 1993, which the Knicks won, Reggie in the visitors' locker room at the Garden, surrounded by media, big media post-game scrum. And so I piped in with a question to him, and he looked at me and said, "Hey, we were watching you last night deal with those phone callers. That was great," referring to the call-in show we had on New York One, Sports on One. And so obviously I got a chuckle out of that. He said, "Hey, whatever you want. What do you need?" So I asked a few more questions, whatever they were. Who remembers? Back in Indiana, the Pacers win Game 3. That was the John Starks headbutt game, 1993. And afterwards, I said to Reggie, look, thanks, Reg. Now I have to stay here. I was supposed to have a date back in New York tomorrow night. He smiled and he said, "I guess you're just going to have dinner in Indianapolis with Pat Riley." And so that's the way it went for the next several years. Not necessarily a friendship, but a connection with him. Always a big hello, always a clever comment. And sure, it made what was already a great series that much more fun to cover. And I knew how blessed I was. The Knicks and the Pacers, the Knicks and the Heat, the Knicks and the Bulls. It was a great ride. It was a really wonderful ride. And here's hoping that there's another great ride for the Knicks and their fans and the people who get to cover the City game. I'm Bud Mishkin. Thanks for listening.